Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Tackle's Cloud Go-to-Market Experience. We're so pleased to have you here. I'm Muldera Welch, Director of Engineering at Tackle and your MC for this event. Special thanks to our platinum sponsor,
All right.
Microsoft.
Thank you so
Go.
much for having me today. And today I'm going to walk through the era of marketplaces here. Are you ready to evolve? It's something that we've been talking about for decades, but over the last couple of years, there's been more growth than the last 10 years combined. So I'm going to walk through a number of trends today. I'll walk through a number of background data of why this is so important. And hopefully as we walk through this, we'll understand if we really are ready and what it means to each of our go-to-market strategies, what it means to how we're going to participate across a broader ecosystems, and how marketplaces are going to be, in many cases, the orchestrator of a lot of that. So starting at the very top, there's a $94 trillion world economy last year. You can see it here by geography. One of the reasons I show it by geography is the marketplace rollout, or what our predictions are very geographic centric. A lot of that growth, for example, 1/3 of the US economy through the later stages of the pandemic was through marketplaces, both consumer, B2B2C, and B2B. So as we move that in the United States and Canada, Europe is lower than that, Asia Pacific is lower than that. And so we think that there might be a time delay as marketplace growth around the world picks up. So if we just double click into the technology market, one of 27 industries, we see that $4.5 trillion was spent by businesses and governments last year. Hardware, software, services, the broad scope in the technology industry, including telco, including print, including Pro AV and all the subsections of that. Why it's important is this industry is the fastest growing industry. It's also growing to about 7 trillion, expectations are by the end of the decade. So as things double, we're going through a number of changes in a really fast growing industry that are leading to the era of marketplaces. So at Canalys, we look at this in a number of different ways, but overall, you can start to see the growth numbers, both from where we've come from, but in B2B cloud marketplaces, you start to see the growth numbers where we're calling upwards of $25 billion flowing through marketplaces by 2025. I think that this growth continues. And if you looked at the 5 years beyond there, we're starting to talk very, very large numbers, hundreds of billions going to $1 trillion through marketplaces. But it isn't just happening in technology. You're seeing that every company in every industry is becoming a tech company. So over the last couple of weeks, I've been watching Ford, for example, who started rolling off an electric truck, the F-150, the best-selling car, for example, in North America, is now fully electric. And as they're rolling out, they're making several announcements, and people are wondering about the future of the auto industry. As cars go electric is the first stage, and there's now 62 manufacturers that have gone all in electric. The next stage is self-driving. And then perhaps 10 or 15 years from now, we start talking about transportation as a service. But what's the go-to-market strategy for these vehicles as we go into these next stages? And less inventory, more online sales, a lot of talk about dealerships and looking at Tesla as the North Star in the industry, or a guidepost for squeezing more profit. So talking through these things in public, for example, has ramifications. So this shows up the next day in the newspaper, a degree of panic and having to address what has been over 100-year industry in a very specific, but we know that any as a service, whether it's transportation as a service, or if you look at pharmaceuticals or banking or insurance or manufacturing, any industry as it moves into as a service is going to become more digital in nature in terms of how it's purchased and procured and how it's managed. And so you see a funny quote here about freaking out before I'd shaven that morning. But these conversations are now happening beyond technology. And we're starting to talk about marketplaces now in every facet of our lives, from obviously the consumer side of our lives to the professional and business side of our lives. So I want to shake down with the time I've got here, some of the major trends that we're watching and be able to look at what this means for our businesses, what this means, in terms of marketplace growth and other types of things. But the one thing I go back to is some work that Accenture did, that went and talked to CEOs in every company, every size, every geography, every industry, and asked them the question. And 76% of CEOs today around the world think their current business model will be unrecognizable in 5 years. And they targeted ecosystems as the number one reason why. We can't do it alone anymore. And so when you start looking through the bookshelf and start understanding what these business models are going to look like, you start seeing obviously the growth of subscription and consumption models. You're seeing direct to consumer starting to float into B2B. You're seeing product-led growth companies. During the pandemic, we saw companies like Zoom and Slack and others grow their sales, their marketing, their channels were all built within the product itself. Usage-based and value-based pricing, and obviously marketplaces that sit as the underpinning of all these new business models. It's not the trade that we've had in the past. Everything becomes much more digitized. So back into the technology industry, we started to see over the last couple of years, major companies go all in 100% subscription consumption. Cisco kind of kicked it off. Well, today, 1/3 of Cisco is now subscription. And they're going from there to try to figure out a way to get to 100%. You saw Michael Dell with over $100 billion across 7 companies within Dell Technologies commit across the board to 100% subscription consumption within Apex. You saw Lenovo announce TrueScale, same thing, end-to-end, 100% commitment to this new business model. HPE, which is ahead of the previous companies, they've been working on GreenLake for about 7 years, working on getting it to market and everything else. Over the last 3 years, they're now delivering bigger growth. And as you see here, triple-digit growth that's outpacing even some of the big hyperscalers and public cloud companies. And they're doing this through a subscription model. Instead of a $1 million server that you would have bought from HPE in the past, it's now $9,000 a month forever and highly integrated with the broader solution of services and software and everything wrapped around that. Wanted to end on IBM because they've done the same thing. They actually moved off a big part of their services group into a separate company called Kyndryl. And now the company, which is focused on obviously AI and multi-cloud and acquisition of Red Hat, they're all in 100% subscription and consumption, which leads to kind of the second trend is we're now seeing the future of the world through the lens of not really a product SKU type of world that we've been in the past with a linear supply chain, a linear distribution model. We're starting to see co-innovation and value creation and network effects and all kinds of things take shape where a product isn't a product anymore. It's layers of technology, layers of services and solutions and different things that come together that make up the end product. So I wanted to go back to IBM again just quickly because it highlights this future. And it's important to think through marketplaces through the lens of what does the future look like? So from a technology perspective, if you look at emerging tech, by these standards, IBM for 29 straight years has led the patent race. And some years it's not even close. I think last year they were ahead of Samsung and others. So in those 29 years, by this measure, you would think this is the most innovative company on the planet, inventing Internet of Things and AI and automation and blockchain and quantum computing, AI, AR, VR, MR, metaverse, inventing drones and self-driving cars. So all the things we think about as future tech or emerging tech are, the mountain of IP, a lot of it sits here. But at the same time, over the last 10 years, for example, the company has dropped in revenue quarter in, quarter out for a decade. It's half the size now that it was a decade ago. So how could the most innovative or inventive company not be able to monetize this growth and all these inventions? And well, the epiphany came from the most recent CEO, very early on in his job, he thought of ecosystem and committing $1 billion to build out this idea that maybe that Watson, who defeated Jeopardy, Watson, who beat Garry Kasparov at chess in the 1990s, maybe Watson wasn't a product after all. Maybe it's not a SKU that you can buy through distribution or through a marketplace that can cure cancer, that can predict nuclear explosions, can predict the weather. They bought the Weather Channel back in the day. Maybe it's not a product at all, but an embedded or a white label type of product that, it should be the AI inside the software we use. So if they would have sold it instead to hospitals 10 years ago and sold it to Salesforce, Salesforce may not have had to build Einstein, and our product that we use might have Watson inside. Our car may have Watson inside. Our toothbrush has Watson inside. We're kind of getting, if you think of every one of those emerging tech models that I went through around blockchain and AI and Internet of Things, these aren't SKUs as we think about them, but they're building blocks. And an ecosystem it takes to be able to successfully navigate that. So I wanted to touch on that because this layered innovation, it has to be delivered in a highly digital, highly integrated way. And it's not, picking out SKU numbers as you normally would off a grocery store shelf or a traditional way of buying, with a contract or an RFP. It's layers of technology that has to be moved together and procured and provisioned in the same place. The third major change, which is an obvious one, is the changing buyer. Obviously, changing demographics. We have changing psychology and behavior, a changing customer journey. We have a new journey itself. So in the early days, there are 28 moments that we now recognize that a customer goes through to get to their vendor selection, their purchase. And so when we look at these early moments, and again, this is consumer or it's B2B, whether you're buying a car, whether you're buying a mattress, whether you're buying software, whether you're adding technology layers to your infrastructure, you end up as a consumer looking to do more of this on your own. So there's all kinds of different vehicles that you use as you walk through these steps. And we're starting to see, some of these are obvious. If you're buying a car, you're going to go and watch videos on YouTube. You're going to go talk to your neighbors, go on social media, figure out how to do that. But in every case, we're starting to see marketplaces play a much bigger role in the early journey. This isn't about e-commerce. It's not about the actual procurement or purchase at this point. It's about making customers smarter. And if they have to buy layers, today the average SaaS deal, for example, software deal, has 7 layers to it. So you might choose your base platform that you're going to buy, but you'll customize it with 6 other companies on average. And marketplaces are playing a big role in terms of getting us to the point as consumers, as business buyers, to be smart enough to make vendor selection without going through a traditional cycle. At the point of purchase now, mentioned subscription and consumption models and everything else, it's only the first 30 days with the customer, or in some case, the first year, depending on what the timeline is. But the fact of the matter is, the procurement of the good has always been, for thousands of years, the main thing we focused on, especially in the tech industry over the last 40 years. The point of purchase is where all the money flowed. We paid everything in terms of gross to nets or partner margins at that point, assuming that that partner got the customer to the dance and is going to keep them dancing so that they renew with us. So what ended up happening is we paid partners, at least half of them, we overpaid, and maybe half of them we underpaid. So this is an interesting idea where if we can pay at the point of value, if we can start recognizing where marketplaces, where different kind of partner activities work and start paying at the point of value, it's a big change. Marketplaces are one of the places that enable or orchestrate our ability to do that. And now in a subscription model, it's every 30 days forever. You'll recognize a few weeks ago when Netflix, announced their subscription, new subscriber, and churn rate, the company dropped by almost 60% in value overnight because those numbers aren't what people expected. So it's not how much revenue, it's not how much profit they had, it's not what their customer sat or net promoter score was, it's literally, these are the metrics of the future. So every one of those previous companies that I recognized, and every other company that's going into, at least 76% of them that are going into these new business models, now have to look at this and say, how do I drive adoption of my products, make habit forming and make them sticky, make deeper integrations happen, upsell, cross-sell, enrichment. How's this going to happen every 30 days forever? And this is the new mantra, is I now have 3 unique things I need to do inside my customer journey, from that early point of influence in making sure that I'm handling all of the different kinds of partners, for example, that are in there, and I'm orchestrating or I'm attributing what they're doing. I'm sharing data with them. At the point of transaction, I've got a very frictionless way to move my customer onto the model, the consumption model or the subscription model. And then expansion, every 30 days forever, I'm working in a very large ecosystem now of partners. And the orchestrator of all that is what we're talking about today, is where does that make the most sense? And that has to happen digitally. We're talking about millions of partners. We're talking about 35 million types of customers. So the numbers are too big for this to be a human organization. And then underneath all of that, there's a foundation of technology alliances and strategic alliances and business alliances. So we're now looking at 6 swim lanes from a channel strategy perspective. And we're looking at 6 swim lanes in terms of how are we going to manage and monitor and measure all of these different steps and be able to do that in a consistent way. And I can say that a lot of that investment is going into marketplaces, being that point of management of this entire almost chaos theory of how to manage all these moving parts. And so we started looking at the partnership side of things, and we can see 30x growth in terms of how many partners are going to be inside or assisting or influencing marketplace sales. I saw a stat the other day that said 24% of marketplace activity today is either walked in by a direct sales rep or it's walked in by a partner of some type, and these numbers are going to grow. And so companies are looking less about what percentage of sales go through partners indirectly, and they're starting to ask what percentage of their overall business is partner assisted. And so if you're Microsoft, for example, which is a very channel-friendly company, today it's 96% of every dollar they make. They're the second most valuable company in the world. 96% of every dollar they make is partner assisted across those 3 stages in the journey. And the next trend we're watching is the staying power of marketplaces. So the big debate when marketplaces grew more in the first 3 months of the pandemic than the last 10 years combined, we got this big jump, is what starts to happen. And we're definitely not post-pandemic right now, depending on where you live and what the warnings are for, third and fourth quarter of this year. But at this stage of the pandemic, we're starting to see what many thought might be a drop-off or a plateau. And the answer is no. It was a bump, and here's a bunch of consumer categories across the right. But as you know, and what I kind of went through in terms of the different psychology and behavior and demographics of the consumer, that's floating into B2B. And so as we're watching all this marketplace activity, it continues to grow. And so this pandemic bump, isn't plateauing. It isn't coming off of those big numbers. We're going to continue to set new baselines each and every quarter. And so there's obviously a large amount of marketplaces taking shape. So I'm just going to talk about the technology industry for one. On the left-hand side, you've got hyper marketplaces that play a role in commodity level products. So the procurement of PCs or printers, the procurement of storage devices or network firewalls and things. These companies are obviously building out massive logistics and supply chain capabilities to get the product to you within a day or within a few hours in some cases, and building out those capabilities. So they don't care if they're selling a consumer good or a B2B product in their long tail, it's going to have a chunk. The bigger story is in the middle. We're watching 20 companies right now build out, spend billions of dollars each on their capabilities within these super marketplaces. This is where Tackle comes in. This is where the large opportunity for every company in the world to start figuring out, where does it make sense to go and hang up a shingle and start to become part of that marketplace. And so their ability to drive partnerships and co-innovation and all these things are increasing. And we're in the early innings. We're only in a couple of years into this, but there's massive technology and innovation going into these places. And every company, almost in every industry, is going to have to look in the middle here and start to figure out new go-to-market strategies, routes to market strategies, and things like that. There's also interest on the side. I once said that, perhaps 80% of SaaS and infrastructure and platform as a service, really the software market, is going to grow through super marketplaces. Niche marketplaces are also very important. So these super large marketplaces don't really focus on a specific industry or a specific geography, buyer type, segment of the market, SMB versus enterprise, a product area, a service model, like managed services. So there's a massive growth of niche marketplaces that do that. And we're seeing things like Miracle out of Europe raise 555 million to take on some of that long tail marketplace activity. We're seeing in the United States, AppDirect continues to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to go play that. So marketplace development platforms, which there's hundreds of, we're starting to see the top 5. Even a small company out of Saskatoon, Canada, raised $119 million, to build out marketplace technology. So as every company in the world, especially technology companies, are going to start to have to look at how they do this. And this is the reason for the strong growth of Tackle, is that people are looking to outsource many of these different things. You can't take your engineers off the product. You can't take your marketing and sales folks off their jobs to go and start figuring out all these different things. So you need a partner to be able to go and do this at scale. And that's where we're starting to see this emerge and start to mature very quickly, only a few years in to this era of marketplaces. So in terms of the numbers, you can kind of see this overlap, which is today 3 billion growing to 25 billion. And that's in the software and SaaS markets. The other piece that we're watching with great interest in marketplaces all across the board, from consumer right up to business, is taxation. And you may have followed Apple struggles with the New York Times trying to charge them 40 or 45% to be in Apple News. You may have followed their court case with Epic Games, charging them 30% from a consumer side to be in their marketplace. You're starting to see SaaS companies, for example, the Salesforce, the ServiceNows, the Workdays, the Marketos, the NetSuites of the world, the HubSpots of the world, charge around 15%. And you could call it taxation or you could call it marketplace fees. But last year, Microsoft dropped a gauntlet by dropping their fees from 20% to 3%, which makes marketplace activity look more like a credit card swipe, which it costs the vendor, the retailer, 30% every time you swipe your credit card. Google had to follow within 30 days. AWS is somewhere between 5, but you can get to 3 on volume. So this is setting the new target. And we're wondering somewhere between 3 and 15 and 30 to 40, where all of this comes. And in the next couple of years, I think we're going to settle down to those lower numbers in terms of marketplace as a service. And these companies who run these big marketplaces are not looking to profit from their ecosystem. And they're looking just to pay the bills and be able to manage the technology and the marketplace with that. Other thing we're watching is the Great Resignation and the future of work and all these types of things happening as well. Other than having a discussion about 72, which I don't believe, and I don't think any of us believe that people are going to quit. That being said, the change is happening. People are moving to higher paying jobs, but this is reminding every company around automation. One of the fastest growing industries inside the pandemic was automation. You saw RPA, for example, robotic process automation, growing by 73% year over year over year. And the fact of the matter is, marketplace is that cornerstone or one of the endpoints of automation. And so if there is fluctuation in people, if there is a lack of predictability in terms of what we can do with human resources or human capital, companies are now hedging their bets and placing those bets into automated. And especially as you're getting into my previous conversation, this chaos theory of procurement and provisioning today, one place of automation is to go harder into marketplaces to push back against some of the macro level economic headwinds that we're facing, especially in 2022, things that we would not have expected around the world, around supply chain and a war in Europe and everything else. This all bodes well for digital means, such as marketplaces. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is distributors. So there is obviously a lot of disruption happening on the distribution side across every industry. And this idea of this orchestrator, can the distributor play that role of marketplace? Can they play the role of orchestration? That seems to be, for decades, upwards of 40 years, what they've been doing. So, for example, private equity took Tech Data and Synnex Private and put them together as TD Synnex last year, made the biggest distributor in the world. We've seen another tier of distribution come out, which are marketplace distribution. This example, Pax8 raised a couple $100 million. There's other companies like SureWeb. There's 100 companies around the world that do this level, and they don't distribute atoms, they distribute bits. So these are marketplaces. They don't own distribution centers. They don't own logistics and supply chain. They don't own capital and credit functions that distributors in the past. So they get to jump ahead and be future friendly as another layer of distribution. Another layer from there is the convergence in. So in the tech industry, for example, all of the telco, which used to be called master agents, are now called tech solution brokers. The tech solution brokers are now coming in and building out their functionality. So distribution isn't just a single value-added distributor anymore. You have a lot of choices depending on what you sell and what you do. You have a lot of choices in terms of how you're going to, put together your own go-to-market strategy. So there is orchestration there as well. And as you're looking at, previously I talked about the hyper marketplaces and the super marketplaces and the app development firms. Now you may have a fourth layer here, which are distributors that are spending billions of dollars to build out their capabilities for the future. So we know distributors have to come out of hiding. In an ecosystem, in a marketplace, for example, you can't hide behind someone else. And number two, they have to become platforms for distribution. Again, it's not about moving goods across oceans and storing them and warehousing them. It's not about the inventory levels as much now as it's about the layers of technology, that embedded world that I talked about, and their ability to grow up and become part of your mission at how you get to market. And for example, how Tackle uses, this as another fourth perhaps element of how you're going to build out your go-to-market strategy, especially your digital third-party go-to-market strategy. So we covered a lot of ground in terms of marketplaces. I think that these 6 trends pretty much solidify the growth numbers that we put on the board. And as we look out past, even the end of this decade, this is a place where, some companies are going to see a third of their revenue start to move through marketplaces. So you need to ask the deeper questions of, what does this mean? A marketplace isn't just a thing. It's almost like the cloud. It's becoming nebulous. So let's roll up our sleeves a bit and work with, for example, companies like Tackle and others that can really navigate what's best for my company and how best for my company to best create a frictionless, wonderful customer experience and be able to protect our own business model as it changes over the next few years, and to really build out this digital first and really customer friendly environment that we all have to evolve to. And I think it's fantastic, the event today, and I think it's fantastic that we all spend more time, thinking about how money changes hands in the future. And books will be written decades from now, looking backwards, but all of us get the fun of living through it forwards. So thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to the rest of the event and hope you do as well.